I'm going to now face off with my brilliant opponent, the one and only Lucas Thorpe, Catman.
Catman extraordinaire.
Okay, so now, after all these adventures in embodied action and embodied existence, we get to the spiritual part. So we're going to talk about transubstantiation. When the body becomes not something just corporeal, but it becomes something spiritual. So Novalis once said, the body, there's only one temple in the world that I know of. It is the temple, it is the body of man. Okay? And so I'm going to look at this transubstantiation by trying to give an account of embodiment. And then Christina Orban will talk about the account of the multimodal body self that we've developed together. That will be the minimal conception of self. And then finally I'll draw together the consequences for understanding the relation between the personal and subpersonal levels of explanation. So if we return to our question, remember the question I began with was, how does an agent need to be in touch with, represent her body in order to act with it? And I talked about different ways an agent is in touch with her body through proprioception, through ownership, through balance, and so on and so forth. And there'll be other ways which we haven't talked about here, but will be in the book. Through interoception, for example, and also the sense of agency. So we found the core of a number of ways that an agent is in touch with her body and acting with it. Question: what are the ramifications of this account of embodied agency for embodiment? Okay, there's a lot of talk of embodiment, and this is what I want to explore now. So one way of formulating that question, if I want to take the schema that I began with, is to ask, how does an agent need to be in touch with or represent her body in order to be embodied in it? Okay, so there we have the question of embodiment. So embodiment is a term of art in philosophy and the cognitive sciences. To some parties it means a good thing, and to some other parties it means a terrible thing. It depends. So our dear old departed friend Fodor, he hated embodied things, for example, and some other theorists, another dear old departed theorist, Gibson, he loved embodied things. So you have different parties, and it means very, very many different things. Wilson has this, I can't remember her first name. Is it Margaret Wilson, the 6 Views on Embodied Cognition? Very famous review.
Yeah, not Catherine, it's Margaret.
Margaret Wilson. Yeah. So Margaret Wilson, the psychologist, has a very, very nice review paper, 6 Views on Embodied Cognition, differentiating different forms of the notion of embodiment. That you have some kind of imitative aspects, you have, for example, the use of motor simulation, and so on and so forth. So the sense of embodiment I'm interested in here is none of Wilson's 6 senses. Okay, it's a much, much older sense of embodiment. Maybe I want to say that it's the Aristotelian sense, but I think there are no textual grounds for that. So it's a philosophical sense of embodiment. Okay, it's a sense that is shared by some philosophers like O'Shaughnessy and myself, other people within the kind of spatial representation project that was at King's College, Cambridge at some point, led by Naomi Aylan, and then migrated slowly to work. There's some sense that there's a question about the relation between a subject and her body. Okay, Lucas doesn't like this talk of relation, but he'll attack me later. So I want to say embodiment is the distinctive way a subject inhabits her body, and it comes with a distinctive phenomenology. So this is the phenomenology we've been talking about already. The minimal sense is this what I call the non-pilot phenomenology, the distinctive where you feel your body from the inside, the distinctive where you can act with it. And this is the non-pilot logo. So if you're one of the non-pilot theorists, you have this badge. One question that immediately comes up is this: does embodiment, the question of embodiment, only arise for Cartesian dualists? Okay, so you might say, well, if there's a question about relating subjects to their bodies, a presupposition is that subjects must be distinct from their bodies. Okay, it seems to be a conceptual presupposition of that question. So you might think, well, what if we don't think that subjects are distinct from their bodies? So you might think, maybe you can't raise the question of embodiment already if you are a body. So maybe you think you can't raise the question of how you can have a body in some sense, quote, have, if you are, quote, are your body, or quote, your body, depends on your metaphysics of the person. Okay, so you might have that view. But one way to sort of motivate the idea that there's still a question is to observe that if embodiment were truly only a question for dualists, then you would think that there should be no cases that you would intuitively describe as pathologies of embodiment or ways of, quote, losing your body. Okay, because if you're a materialist, all problems of embodiment dissipate. That's not the case. There seems to be various pathologies of embodiment. These are not necessarily described by people as pathologies of embodiment, but if you think about them, they are ways of losing one's body. So you think of pathologies of bodily action. So if you're paralyzed, there's a sense in which you've lost a certain kind of relationship with your body that allows you to be fully inhabiting your body. If you're locked-in syndrome patient, so in locked-in syndrome, patients have cognitively intact faculties, but because of some kind of spinal cord disconnection or some brainstem damage, they can no longer send signals to the periphery. Okay, they can communicate via, maybe blinking, or some cases now they can communicate with neuroimaging devices. But these are minds that are locked in their bodies but have lost their bodies in some way. Okay. And another case of pathology of action is anarchic hand syndrome. So in anarchic hand syndrome, usually you have a unilateral damage to the premotor area or the supplementary motor area, and what happens is you get a disinhibition syndrome. So I'm going to act out a video of an anarchic hand patient. I'm trying to put on my shirt. So this is the final button. I'm going to try to button my shirt, and my left hand is anarchic, and as I try to do this other hand is trying to unbutton it. Okay, and this is what happens in some cases of anarchic hand syndrome. So you have quite purposive, goal-directed behaviors, but they're not under the voluntary control of the subject. Okay, it's very striking. So this is on the action side. Now, if we look on the perception side, you have various pathologies of bodily experience that intuitively seem also like ways of losing your body. So think of the case of a subject who's experiencing numbness after a stroke in large parts of his body. It's one way of losing his body. Think of the subject IW who suffers from peripheral deafferentation, having no proprioception or touch from the collar bone line down. So normally I post the slides, but this part of the slides is 30 megabytes, and Google refuses to let me post it on my website. So I can email it to people now if they want. Is there some address where I can send it to? So that
yeah, you can send it to Duigu to our Coxeye address, and we'll send it around.
Is it running from the USB?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
We can do it later.
Okay, so there's numbness, deafferentation. Think of cases of dizziness somehow. Maybe you don't feel, well, depending on the case, I think Jack, he just told us that in vertigo sometimes you feel more embodied. So dizziness might be a case where you have a pathology of embodiment. And think of the people who experience autoscopic hallucinations. So there you have cases of out-of-body experiences, looking back at yourself. Okay, these are very clearly cases of not having an appropriate relation between the subject and the body in some way. Okay? Now, if these are ways of losing one's body, ways of being disembodied, then we seem to have an issue about explaining the contrast between paradigm, normal embodiment, and these cases. If it were just a Cartesian problem, then a materialist should do the following. An immaterialist, sorry. You should say, if materialism means that problems of embodiment dissolve, well, since we have cases of disembodiment here, there are problems of embodiment, we do a modus tollens. So there are problems of embodiment, so materialism is false. I think nobody would take this seriously. Okay? Maybe someone has argued this, but nobody would take this argument seriously. So what this indicates is that regardless of your metaphysics in a way, the problem of articulating the paradigm relation between a subject and his or her body remains. Because we want to capture the contrast between these cases, paradigm embodiment, and these cases which we intuitively want to describe as ways of losing one's body. Okay, so the last time I gave a version of this talk, it was also in Turkey. Very nice. So this is my uniquely Turkish talk. It's not given in Turkish. Intellectually, it has roots in Turkey. Eric Olson was shooting rockets at me because his thought is that you can only give an account of embodiment if once you fix the metaphysics of subjects and their bodies. You have to fix that. And so you fix it in the way a Cartesian dualist has it, and then you say, well, what you need is psychophysical causal relations, hooking up in the correct kind of way, assuming you can solve pairing problems and stuff like that. Now, if you are functionalists like Shoemaker, and you believe also in a neo-Lockean view of personal identity that sets up a different metaphysics, and then you give a different account of embodiment. Okay? And if you're David Wiggins with substance metaphysics and the animalist metaphysics with the face auto, then you have a different way of understanding what embodiment is. Now, I think this isn't the way I want to go. I want to try to attempt to give metaphysics neutral account of these things, or at least as metaphysically neutral as, I think there's a giant who doesn't like to talk, as I can. And I think it's possible because in a way the cases that we dealt with in the beginning, these pathologies of embodiment, the contrast between the good cases and the pathologies is something we want to capture regardless of the metaphysics. Okay? So in this domain, I think it's not metaphysics first. It's metaphysics later. Metaphysics after coffee. Okay. So how can we do that? In order to do that, you have to have some kind of leeway into your problem. And you can only do that if there's an intuitive conception of subjects and intuitive conception of bodies such that you can raise the question. And I'm going to propose that we can do that by thinking of subjects roughly for my project. A subject is a normal human adult. A normal human adult subject is, among other things, a locus of psychological activity, and observe that the psychological activity is sometimes self-reflexive. And from within this psychological perspective, one can identify a subject, oneself, as it were, from the inside. Okay? I hope the Istanbul crowd does not disagree with this use of from the inside. Now, this is the notion of subjects. How about bodies? So we can say bodies. So we know what are hands, okay? Unless you're Van Inwagen or some kind of nihilist like Peter Unger, you believe they're hands. So if you know what are hands, then we can know what are bodies from hands. Because we can say bodies are those material objects that are the holes that one's limbs and extremities belong to. Okay, that's the intuitive notion of bodies. So if we have this notion of subjects, we have this notion of bodies, we may make no presuppositions about their metaphysical relations vis-a-vis one another. We can then pose the problem within this neutral metaphysics, neutral account. Okay, one way to go is then immediately go for what might be called a metaphysical account of embodiment, and that's what we find in a number of philosophers, Shoemaker, John Foster, and more recently Barry Dayton. And the shape of the account they give is this. These are my restatements of the account. The original Shoemaker statement is in terms of the causal theory of action and the causal theory of perception. I've made this simpler. It's a very simple account. Basically, a body is your body if it's the body that you act with and it's the body that you perceive through. So there are two independent conditions. The idea is that a body is your agentive body, or that you're agentially embodied in that body, to the degree that you can intentionally act with it. And then there's a perception condition. You're perceptually embodied in a certain body to the extent that interactions of that body with its surroundings result in you having veridical experiences of the surroundings. If you're a disjunctivist, then you just say experiences, and so on and so forth. So you can adjust it as you like. But the central idea is very simple. Body is yours. A body is your agentive body if you can act with it. A body is your experiential body if that's the body that you experience through. Notice that this is placed in terms of to the extent that. So it's already a notion which is not necessarily a categorical one, but one in terms of degrees. This is more your body if you can act better with it. So someone who's paralyzed in one hand, for example, will be less agentially embodied in a certain body than someone who's not. Okay, that's the idea. And if someone is blind, for example, or deaf, they will be less perceptually embodied in a certain body. Okay. And Shoemaker, Foster, and colleagues, the thought is that these conditions exhaust embodiment simpliciter. So you have these conditions. A body is the one that you can act and perceive with, and that gives the account of embodiment. Okay? Very simple, very elegant. Okay, so at this stage, I then face a metaphysical, theoretical quandary, because in a way, this account expresses functional relations between a subject and a body, but presupposes the distinctness of a subject and a body. Because an animalist, many of my teachers are animalists, so I get this kind of thing from them. I can hear their voices in my head as I come up with my account. Is that, you could say that a vegetative patient, for example, still has their body. They haven't lost their body in any sense. So why should an animalist say that they've lost their body just because this kind of account presupposes the falsity of animalism in some way. It's not metaphysically neutral. There's a sense in which this metaphysical account presupposes already that there is a disconnection between subjects and their bodies, which is natural, for example, for the functionalist and neo-Lockean that Shoemaker is, and for the Cartesian that John Foster is. So this metaphysical account, in a way, is not consonant with all accounts that we might want to, with all metaphysics of the subject and body that we might have. So we need to find a more metaphysically neutral account if that's possible. And I want to suggest that where we should look is in terms of other kinds of relations. So we should think of other kinds of relations. So the first thing to note is that I posed my question in terms of what's the relation between a subject and a body that has to be there in order for there to be paradigm embodiment. And asked in that way, the question is incredibly vague. So there are many, many relations that you can have to your body. You can have a relation of a prudential concern. You can have a relation that is affective. You can have a relation that is epistemic, metaphysical, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many, many relations you can have to your body. Now, but what is the kind of relation intuitively here that is the one that is the first level at which we can pitch a metaphysically neutral account of these things that can capture the difference between the paradigm cases and the departures from the paradigm case? And I want to suggest that the best way to do that is in terms of some kind of representational account. Now the thought will be that if you have a kind of metaphysics like the functionalist or the neo-Lockean, at the first level they will have a representational account, but then they will further read the representational account as indicating certain structures about the metaphysics of embodiment itself. So what is the representational account, and why might we think that the representational account is the correct way to go? So if you think of cases of tool use and the kind of embodiment involved in tool use, what's happening, or at least what's going on in the first level of explanations is that in using tools and in functional integration of tools, what's explaining that is the representational structure of what's going on with tools. Okay, it's not that the tool is now part of your body in some metaphysical sense. Rather, it's that you are representing the tool as part of your body, or at least your brain is representing the tool as part of your body. Okay, that seems the first level of description. And that also seems to be the correct level of description of some of the pathological cases. What happens is that you have these kinds of diseases of bodily experience. You don't think from cases of having diseases of bodily experience, such as having out-of-body experiences, that these subjects have actually become new subjects in the sense that the metaphysics of these subjects has changed. Okay? That seems unnatural. I mean, some people might want to say that because metaphysicians are a very radical bunch and they like to say radical things. But in the first instance, we wouldn't want to say that. So a representational account seems to be the best way to go here. And so the first move I then make is to transpose the shoemaker conditions to a representational version. And if you notice earlier, the conditions were something is your body if you can act with it. And now in the representational version, sorry, this is very small. We're going to do it differently. So, now the conditions are that a subject represents herself as agentially embodied in a certain body to the extent that she can intentionally act with the body directly. So notice in a way that the account hasn't changed, but the analysance has changed. Okay, the analysance is what we're analyzing. Okay. So now the analysance is what it takes for a subject to represent herself or experience herself or be aware of herself as being embodied in a certain body. And now I think we have the basic shape of an account of embodiment. And the first two conditions are simply those from Shoemaker and Foster transposed into this kind of representational talk. Now, the question then we can ask is, are the action and perception conditions enough to give us embodiment simpliciter? And I argue no. And it's very, very easy to say that, see that I'll say no, because I've been talking about bodily awareness, proprioception for a long time, and these two conditions don't involve a proprioception kind of condition. And proprioception and bodily awareness seems to be a very powerful way in which one experiences oneself as a body, as a bodily being, as a bodily presence. Now, unless either of the action or perception conditions can individually or together get you the bodily awareness condition, you will have to add the bodily awareness condition to get to the case, to cover the case of paradigm embodiment. Okay, I won't go through the arguments, but basically you can't cover bodily awareness just by thinking of the action and perception conditions. Perception, because no amount of exteroception will get you bodily awareness, and action, because even if you're an activist, there are certain kinds of dissociation such that no amount of action will get you the kind of bodily awareness. So intuitively we need a bodily awareness condition, and that's intuitive. So a body you represent a body as being yours if you can both act with it, perceive it, and perceive with it, and also feel it from the inside. What other conditions are necessary? So yesterday we talked about body ownership, and in order to argue that ownership is required, I will then argue that even if you have intact proprioception, you can still have a sense that you're not fully embodied if you have a kind of a sense, if you lack a sense of ownership. So every time the argument for the next condition will be true arguing that the previous conditions aren't enough for paradigm embodiment, because you haven't achieved a case where you can cover that. Okay? So let's argue why body ownership is important. And the case I use is an extension of this case that John Campbell used in the Oxford Common Room for against actually Strawson's account of self-consciousness. So Strawson's account of self-consciousness is that you achieve self-consciousness when roughly you're able to triangulate yourself as somehow the point, the thing which is when you can grasp that your experience is a function both of how you're moving through space and of how you're moving through space and what things you're doing. When you can grasp that your experience is an upshot of how you're moving through space and time, then you achieve self-consciousness in a way. Okay, so I'm not interested in self-consciousness here, but I want to use this in order to try to establish that ownership is in a way important. So the way John Campbell has argued against the Strawsonian account is with a case of what he calls the film subject, and I think this is a case that Istvan would like very much. So in John Campbell's original discussion, it's a subject which treats his experiences like a film. But I think it can't really be a film, because in a film you don't do things with the film. So it's got to be like a video game subject. It's got to be a video game subject. Now, in the video game subject, what happens is that the subject, there's like the first person experiences, well, not first person experiences in egocentric perspective for the subject. Right? And the things that the subject does have effects on the perceptual scene, and things that are happening in the perceptual scene have some kind of consequences for the subject somehow. But the subject somehow is not immersed in the environment, just takes it as a video game. The subject takes it that I can do this and that will happen and that happens and that has these consequences for me. It's just like a video game. But it doesn't take that as his experience. Okay, this is the film subject case. Now, one way we can use this is to ask, is there a way we can have satisfaction of the action condition, the perception condition, and the bodily awareness condition such that you feel your body from the inside, but still feel a kind of alienation with your experiences such that you don't feel your embodied? Yes. So you can take the case of somatoparaphrenia. Remember this feeling of alienation towards one of your limbs. In actual empirical fact, there are no stable cases of complete somatoparaphrenia. So we need to, as philosophers, call on our imaginative capacities and invent philosophical somatoparaphrenia. Another John Campbell device. Okay? So in the case of philosophical somatoparaphrenia, what you have is complete deafferentation over your whole body, complete alienness. Okay. Now, in that case, it seems compelling that even if you represent yourself as acting through that body, you represent yourself as perceiving through that body, you represent yourself as feeling that body from the inside, if you represent yourself in a way as alien from the body, there is in some sense in which you are not fully embodied in that body. Okay? So it seems that we need a body ownership condition. Finally, I want to look at whether there's another condition that is in some way related to the body ownership condition, but may not be completely distinct. And this is the affect condition. So the pressure for the affect condition comes from thinking about a whole range of pathologies that have come to light in the last 30, 40 years. So if we think of Cotard syndrome, or if we think of cases of depersonalization or derealization, these seem to be pathologies partly of affect. Okay? So, so let's look at Cotard's. There's a range of different kinds of delusions. You have desomatization delusions, which involve not feeling your body. So we can group those together with either ownership or with the bodily awareness component. They are dementalization delusions. So the patients will say, if I had a brain, I would think, but I do not think. And the most severe cases of Cotard's involve death and non-existence delusions. So this is a patient. You know that we have drowned. It's not me who's talking to you. You are talking to yourself in me. I'm not anything anymore. I do not exist. Okay? So usually these Cotard's and delusions like this are called monothematic delusions, and the orthodox account of these comes from Cotard and Davies, and it's explained as involving two factors. The first factor is some kind of weird experience. Okay, weird experience. So there's some kind of weird thing going on with their sensory apparatus. But you need a second component, because if you just have weird experience, they just say to the doctor, my sensory experience is a bit weird, I don't know what's going on. Okay? But they don't do that. What they do is they have weird rationalizations as well. Okay? They interpret the weirdness in their sensory experience as they're not existing, or they're not having a body, or they're not having a mind, and so on and so forth. So the relevant bits of Cotard syndrome that concern an account of embodiment are those that involve having a body or being embodied in some way. So I take it that in the death and non-existence cases, it's not just that they exist as a corpse, but that they're not there anymore in any sense. Okay, so they're not embodied but as a corpse. But so there are cases in between where they're embodied but as a corpse. They think they're a corpse. And there are cases where they just think they're not there anymore. They're not around anymore. Now, what's interesting in these cases is that there seems to be an affective component in these disorders, in Cotard syndrome, and in the derealization and depersonalization disorders. Now, if that's the case, then the question arises, can we cover the disorders of affect that we looked at here through the action, perception, body awareness, and body ownership conditions? It seems not. Okay? I think I need much more time in order to provide you with the detail, but I argue that it's not the case. Now, and therefore you need an affect condition, okay? Because the cases of affective disorders, whilst they overlap with somatic disorders and with disorders of ownership, are disjoint set, okay? So if that's the case, then we need an affect condition. The subject represents herself as effectively embodied in a certain body to the extent that affective mental states are reflected in bodily changes in that body, and that these bodily changes are experienced without any negative phenomenology of alienation. Okay? So that's the affect condition. Now, once we have that, then the claim I want to make is that these 5 conditions provide the core of paradigm embodiment, which allow us to characterize the contrast between the case of the paradigm, the case of paradigm embodiment, and these different departures from it. one thing about the logic of this project is it's once again what I call the Aristotelian project of trying to give the paradigm. So these are not straightforward, necessary and sufficient conditions in the classical sense that you would get in, say, a project about Gettier epistemology or stuff like that, or the causal theory of action. Now, one difficult question is whether any of these conditions are individually necessary, and I won't answer that here. But let me propose these 5 conditions as the conditions on paradigm embodiment, and that a representational account of embodiment covers the contrast between paradigm embodiment and its departures. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Yeah. So I've got a little handout. So one problem is like going on I was a bit stupid. I should have put myself on the first day, because then I could have made all the really cool objections. So I think a lot of the biggest sort of problems I have already been dealt with.
How many sheets in this handout?
One. Yeah. The Hong Yu's account in this chapter, I think this chapter sort of is bringing together a bunch of the other stuff, and we've seen these 5 conditions, or at least most of them, developed in individual chapters, and now they're being put together. His methodology is that we should understand our normal embodiment by understanding the pathologies of embodiment, and this gives us a grip on what it's normally like. This seems plausible, but I think there's like Istvan. I guess I'm with him as well. I think we can also learn something about the normal cases by looking at other sorts of things, not just pathologies, and in particular by looking at kind of experiences of bodily extension. So I'm going to talk about a few examples of bodily extension. We might think about ways in which they're similar and differ from the normal case. So Hong Yu's argued that there are these 5 aspects of our everyday embodiment. We can think of them as 5 conditions that we find in the normal case: the action, perception, bodily awareness, bodily ownership, and affect. I think it's worth pointing out, he didn't really stress it in this talk, but we got it last time, that in terms of bodily awareness, there's going to be two aspects of it. You could have one without the other, which is the experience of ownership, or the sense of ownership some people talk about, and the judgment of ownership. Yeah, and I take it the idea is we might think that there are some animals, for example, that have the sense of ownership without necessarily having the judgment of ownership. We might think the judgment of ownership is essentially apperceptive in a certain way, whereas the experience of ownership doesn't involve that. So many people, I think going back to the Strawsonian tradition, influenced by Strawson, thought that really what's central are the first 2 conditions, the action and perception condition. And Hong Yu, I think, quite convincingly argues that our sense of it, our embodiment, or our experienced embodiment, involves these other things as well. And I think this seems right. We've had this problem before. I think one of the things that a lot of us have been pushing Hong Yu about is about the modal status of these claims. On the one hand, he doesn't want to say they're necessary and sufficient conditions. You can lose them without losing your body, so they're typical. But he does think there's some sort of dependency. So it's not just this is just how things happen to be. In the normal case, he's got this Aristotelian idea, which I think ultimately is going to appeal to some sort of capacities, and there's going to be some sort of dependency within the capacity. Although if things break down, we could acquire a different way of doing something similar. Yeah, so we can have workarounds that can be quite different, that can give us similar results. But in the usual case, there's a sort of dependency relation. And I think metaphysically I'm quite happy with that. I think you might in the book want to have a little little bit more at the beginning, just talking about this Aristotelian view and capabilities and how it's... Because I think a lot of people are going to come back with the sort of objection Alan gave. Yeah, I'm quite sympathetic to a sort of approach that looks at capacities, and there is a type of dependency relation there. But I think that's something you might want to just be more upfront about at the beginning. Okay, so let me talk about some things. So what time is it now? Okay. So Hong Yu wants to have a metaphysically neutral account of embodiment, and then he gives an account that isn't metaphysically neutral. Yeah. So one thing we might want to think about is how desirable or possible is a metaphysically neutral account? Why is this something we should want? And this is, I think, the argument you were having with Olson. You might think that, you don't want a metaphysically neutral account, you want a metaphysically correct account. I think if you do want to go for metaphysical neutrality, the best thing to do is just not talk about metaphysics and not make any metaphysical commitments. And I think maybe you could drop some stuff without harming it. So I think you've got two places where you're metaphysically committed in a way in which certain people in the kind of embodied cognition literature are going to not be able to buy into. So the first thing is that you argue that embodiment appears to be some kind of relation between a subject and her body, and ways of losing one's body is considered above, such as have got to do with disruptions to the normal functional relations between a subject and her body. And I think this sort of way of talking just seems overly what's the word? Overly dualistic. I'm much more in terms of my metaphysics, which I think is rooted in biology. I think we're animals. I think that it's animals that perceive and are embodied. And I think animals I think if you're going to think about biology, then you need to be some sort of process metaphysician. I think most people in biology think of organisms as living beings, as complex dynamic systems. And then if you've got an approach like this, I think that you're going to think of embodiment not being a relation between a subject and a body, but you're going to think of it in some sort of adverbial account. Yeah, you've got a process, and you've got this how this process works. And I think if you're going to be a process metaphysician in biology, then you're going to think of being a subject. Okay, you can be okay with that, but you're going to say that being a subject is an emergent property of a complex dynamic system, and then these sort of experiences, embodiments, are going to be thought of adverbally. So I have a problem with the kind of this relation between a subject and its body, because this seems like too much metaphysics for me. And I'm just wondering whether you need to say any of this stuff. So couldn't you just get rid of that stuff? And why couldn't you just say an organism represents herself as I'm wondering why you need this. So I'm just wondering whether you could just make, if you want to be neutral, why not just drop all the talk about the relation between a subject and her body? I think secondly that another metaphysical commitment you're making is to the existence of representations, and of course within this field there's a bunch of people who are going to get off the boat there, especially think of it about the sort of radical activists, and I'm thinking especially for body ownership. I mean, I'm just wondering for the animal bodily, the experience of ownership. I'm just wondering whether you really need that to kind of involve a representation. And so I'm wondering for each of these, to what degree you need to be committed to the representation talk. I don't have a problem with representation, so I'm a kind of I like process philosophy, but I'm quite happy with representations because I think you can get the normativity from biology. But this is something where some people are not going to be able to get on board for metaphysical reasons. And also it's not clear whether the representations you're appealing to in each of these cases are supposed to be on the personal level or the subpersonal level. Yeah, and it's not clear whether the subject consciously represents, or whether there's some representational structure. So once again, I think you could be a bit clearer about whether in each of these cases you're thinking of the representations as on the personal level or not. Okay, now I want to talk about some examples of extension. When it's got to do, I'm going to talk about. So one thing is, I think many, and I think here, maybe I'm not going to be disagreeing. I'm just going to be pushing and suggesting kind of further things to think of. I think many people who think about the action and perception condition, you've presented them as kind of quite distinct conditions. But I think there's good reasons to think that there might be a kind of they're sort of combined in a certain way. And I take it that these two conditions, I think that, okay, all of these play a role in embodiment, but I take it embodiment's going to be a quite complex phenomena, and there's different ways of being embodied, and then maybe, because I take it one way of being embodied is having a point of view, a first-person perspective. And I guess you can get a first-person perspective, maybe even from vision, yeah, and definitely if you've got the action and perception, you can have something like a first-person perspective, and I think that's one sense of being embodied. So maybe kind of looking at these conditions, it may turn out you've got these different senses of embodiment, and when we talk about just embodiment, we're actually talking about a whole bunch of different things that are interconnected. I think one thing, so I think with the action and perception things, I think one thing is that I'm going to say a bit about they go together, and secondly, I think that there is the first-person perspective side. So Hong Yu writes, it seems somewhat odd to say in the case of blindness or deafness, one in some sense loses one's body. It would seem more natural in these cases to say that one loses the world visually or auditorily. But I take it that in such cases, if not just you lose the world, but you sort of lose a perspective on the world. So I take it the drone pilot is flying over Baghdad, probably. Muslim country, so like, oh look, there's a mosque. Yeah. So the drone pilot's got us kind of a certain point of view, and when they lose the connection, it's not that just they lose the world, but they lose the point of view. I don't think you'll disagree with this, and I think this is quite important. So you start off this chapter by talking about Descartes. And I think that maybe this is a little bit of, for some of my students, a little bit of history. I think in some sense, yeah, Descartes' much closer to your view than many people would think. So there's a very nice paper by Alison Simmons called Rehumanizing Descartes. And she suggests it's not the mind that sees, it's the human being. And a human being is, for Descartes, is a mind-body union. And the mind alone can just do maths. The mind alone can't perceive the world. And I think one of the things that Descartes stresses about this, that he just takes to be obvious, is that a pure mind could know the layout of this room, could know how all the various bodies relate to each other, but they're not going to know which one's them. Yeah? So to have a sense of which body is yours requires being a human being, and it sort of requires perception. And so there's a difference between our grasp of space as a mathematician and our perceptual, visual grasp of space. So in vision, we don't just perceive the layout, but our point of view within that layout is given. And this is something you find in Gibson that I think you also find in Descartes. So Simmons has a nice conversation about this. He says, listen, simply knowing that the table is located at a certain position on some cosmic Cartesian coordinate system would not help me put a plate on it. Yeah, size. Yeah, I mean, what you need to know is relative size relative to you. And so I think that the action and perceptions conditions, I think it's worth stressing that having a point of view, I think, is going to be quite important for this. Secondly, I think that so I'm a bit worried by this feeling from the inside. We've talked about this already, so this is and I think it's not that, I don't think the Istanbul line is we're against feeling from the inside. We just think, all right, I think kind of originally that it's just a metaphor, and you need to cash it out more explicitly. And I think the way you try to cash it out now is in terms of proprioception. And I think even here there's still a problem, because I think one thing is what about touch? Yeah, and
Covered
what?
Perception conditions.
Well, so I'm not sure about that, because you've got, touch is a weird sense, because in some sense touch is a way of getting in touch with things outside of you, but in so doing you're also in touch with yourself, yeah? And so touch, in some sense, it's the boundary between you and the world, and so I think in touch, thinking of touch merely as an external sense, I think maybe seems a mistake. And it seems to me that in the cases of deafferation you've looked at, these people have lost proprioception and touch. And then the question is well, given the fact they've lost both, what's really, which one's playing the really big role? Could you get someone who's deafferated just in terms of proprioception or just in terms of touch? And
it's the same nerves.
Yeah, so in some sense, I think it's difficult to kind of pull them apart. And so I think you've got a drone pilot, but then I think you've got a helicopter pilot, and this is an example Andy Clark talks about. So you have these people wearing these tactile flight suits. I've got the handout here, and it works by generating bodily sensations via safe puffs of air inside the suit. If the craft is tilting to the right or left or forward or backwards, the pilot feels a puff. Vibrating sensation on that side of the body. When the pilot wears the suit, the helicopter behaves very much like an extended body to the pilot. It rapidly links the pilot to the aircraft in the same kind of closed-loop interaction. What matters in each case is the provision of a closed-loop signaling so that motor commands affect sensory input. And what we do when we get trained in a thing like this is to match motor commands to sensory input, and we learn it through a sort of looping. So I think the helicopter, this sort of pilot case, I take it that this kind of, the way one can be embodied in this case is going to involve not just having an action condition or a perception condition, but I think we get the experience of embodiment through this sort of I think Andy Clark is right, not always right about this, but I think in this sort of case, I think the looping stuff is important. And I think that when we get this looping, then the sort of body becomes what he says transparent in use. So there's using a tool fluidly, and in some sense, then the tool is transparent. And I think this idea of transparency is important. I'm wondering how that's going to fit into your conditions here. So we've got this notion of transparency, and I think there's also work done in Osnabrück that I think is quite interesting, where they try to create a new sense, where you have a sense of magnetic north, and you have these vibrating cell phone little vibrators, and it vibrates at north. And once people have worn it for some time, some of them get really good at dead reckoning tasks. So you're in a square in some nice European city, and you're blindfolded, and you're taken around on a path, and then you have to, without seeing, you've got to come back to the starting point. And people who've worn this stuff get better at that. But there's a correlation. They also do a sort of phenomenological study, and they take diaries, and it turns out that the people who stop experiencing the vibrating are the ones who in some sense learn to incorporate this new sensory organ into their system. It's not an outside source of information, but the people who learn to use it in some sense, the belt has become transparent in use in this way. So I'm wondering how, I think this notion of transparency is quite important, and how something can become transparent, and I'm wondering how you're going to fit that in. I think that these sort of cases show that perception and action are not separated. I think also, though, feeling from the inside, I think if there's a difference between it being a drone and being a pilot, and one thing about aeroplanes is that they vibrate, and so I think that in some sense, if touch is a source of feeling from the inside in general, and I think it is, then I think in some sense if you're in an aeroplane that's vibrating, you're feeling the vibration from the inside, or you're feeling the vibration of the aeroplane directly. I think with touch, when we have something, we touch it with the end of a tool. And so so you're shaking your head, but it seems to me I'm really confused about touch and the relationship between touch and feeling from the inside, because it seems to me if you've got this notion of feeling from the inside, it seems not just proprioception, but touch somehow seems to be involved in that. And touch is this weird, promiscuous sense that in some sense gives us both the inside and the outside. Finally, and this is another problem with feeling from the inside, I take it that when we feel from the inside, it's not that we feel every part from the inside, yeah? So, there's some evidence that people incorporate their sticks into their body schemas, the walking stick, and they're able to touch the ground with the end of the stick. And so it looks like they satisfy conditions 1, 2, and some version of 4. But it's not clear of what to make of the fact that they don't feel the stick from the inside. So clearly there are no nerves in the stick, so you're not getting any, but you don't have nerves at every point in your arm. Yeah, so feeling from the inside doesn't, and I take it as far as they've incorporated the stick into their limb, it seems plausible to me to say that they feel the stick as part of an organ they feel from the inside. Yeah, and so for example, there is a sense in which we feel our eyes from the inside. So when I move my eyes, I'm getting some proprioceptive feedback. But it's not like I feel every part of my eyes from the inside. So feeling something from the inside doesn't entail feeling all the parts from the inside. So the retina is part of my visual system, but I don't think we feel our retinas from the inside, but we feel our eyes, and the eyes. And so I think in terms of feeling from the inside, if you've incorporated something into an organ that you feel from the inside, then in some sense that becomes part of something you feel from the inside. So I think with the case of the stick, I think there's a good case to be made that the blind person using their stick does, in some sense, feel the stick from the inside because it's part of an organ they feel from the inside. So that's the second thing. I have a bit of a problem with this condition, with affect, and I'm not sure whether this is really needed as a separate condition or whether it can be collapsed in particular into the experience of ownership. Yeah, and so I think it might be worthwhile kind of telling us why you think you know separate affect condition, when you might think a lot of the affect stuff is going to be involved in this experience of ownership, and isn't that going to be the affective state? Can depersonalization and derealization disorder be cashed out in terms of a problem with the experience of ownership? It's not clear to me. Number 5. I think one thing that, once again, I think you mentioned this in some other chapter, but I think something that I think perhaps you could stress more. It seems to me that the sense of ownership and embodiment is really tied to self-preservation, and this is something that Descartes once again really stresses, that our bodies are things we care about preserving, and so we have this immediate inclination to kind of protect our own bodies, and I'm wondering to what degree this sort of normative side or evaluative side of embodiment is going to fit in. I guess you might fit it in here with affect. So you might, but I think the thing about this sort of self-preservation and this evaluative side, it could be worked out more. Because I think first of all, there's an evaluative side of things. Secondly, there might be a sort of teleological side to this. So the notion of self-preservation. And of course, once again, this is naturalistically quite easily cashed out if you're, this is what animals do. And let me just finish off by reading this stuff from Descartes. So this is once again from the Simmons. Descartes, and I think this is something Descartes gets right. I think this is completely compatible with a bunch of what you say, but I think this may be something to think about a bit more. Descartes sometimes calls bodily sensations internal sensations, and with good reason. They give us a sense of our own bodies from the inside in a way that the observational senses do not. These sensations are especially important to the task of self-preservation. It's precisely by experiencing bodily sensations that I'm able to identify this particular hunk of the corporeal world as mine or as me. With their view from the inside, they confer a phenomenological sense of ownership or self-identity on the body in which they're felt to occur. When I step on a nail, I do not simply observe pain in a foot, but rather pain in my foot, or pain in a part of me, and then this motivates me to act. And so one thing you haven't talked very much about at all is pain and pleasure. And in the Phaedo, Plato says, our body is our prison, and we're in some sense chained to our bodies by pain and pleasure. And so I think once again, and I think with affect, there's more, because I take it like you've got fear and you've got disgust, so you've got emotions that are embodied emotions. So in some sense, when you're disgusted by something, there is this sort of, this is going to be something that is going to harm your body. you want to vomit it out, make it external, you don't want it inside you. So you've got these sort of affective emotions, but then you've got pain and pleasure, and I think, I don't know if you've had pleasure, but bodily pleasure. When you have bodily pleasure, you become, this is a way of being in touch with your body. Yeah, it's something the French talk about a lot. Yeah. You don't want to sound French, do you? But becoming flesh, Sartre has this nice thing about sex where, and this paper by Nagel on sexual perversion, and I think this sort of becoming flesh stuff is quite, and this is one sense of embodiment, once again, sexual embodiment, this becoming flesh. I think there is something right about that. That does seem to be effective, but this effect thing just seems to be a bit of a catch-all, and I think there needs to be more stuff worked out. Also, final point, Courtauld syndrome. When I was a teenager, I once had this experience. I'm not going to tell you how. And I thought I didn't exist. But I'm trying to remember that experience.
You were right.
Yeah, it was really weird. Yeah, I lost. It was like there was thought going on, but it wasn't anyone's. I'm not sure that's really an experience of disembodiment. So I'm not sure that's a pathology of disembodiment, because I think in that situation it wasn't like I wasn't aware of my body. Like my body was fine. I didn't exist. Yeah. And so I'm not sure whether this really is a pathology of embodiment, thinking you don't exist. And I think one reason you think it is a pathology of embodiment is because you've given this sort of over-metaphysically Cartesian account at the beginning, where you think embodiment has got to do with the relation between a subject and a body. And so if you lose your subjectivity, that's going to be a pathology of embodiment. But from my perspective, it doesn't seem to be a pathology that's really about the body. It's a breakdown of maybe apperception. Yeah, you lose the idea of the unity of consciousness. You think there's thought going on, but there's no one having it.
Who is embodied?
The animal. If you take embodiment to be a kind of adverbial properties of processes, then you can have all of this stuff, and there's still the embodied organism, but this embodied organism's lost its sense of subjectivity. Yeah, so losing one's sense of its subjectivity is quite compatible, I think, with being an embodied organism that has the experience I kept the experience of ownership, but I'd lost this sort of belief or something about the unity of our perception. And I'm not sure it's really a pathology of embodiment, unless I think you only take it to be a pathology of embodiment because you've started off by thinking embodiment is the relation between a subject and a body. But if you don't have that, it doesn't seem obviously. This seems to be a product of your metaphysical commitment, maybe, rather than having to do with the phenomena. So having had the experience, I trump. This is like Jack, because that's good for every paper. We should have someone who's okay.
Lucas, is this your body speaking?
Thank you. It's very nice. And did you notice that the Catman had his cat assistant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whispering in his ear.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Where can I start? So affect. Yeah. I agree. It's a catch-all at the moment because I'm not confident that this is enough, and then this is actually precisely meant to capture pain and pleasure, and I was trying to push it to also cover the other cases.
And disgust, I think, is also
yes, that's right. Yeah, because that's why I talk about affective mental states being reflected in bodily changes.
Yeah.
And then I added the second condition, bodily changes being experienced without negative phenomenology of alienation, to cover the cases of affective disorders like Cotards and so on and so forth. So I agree this is a catch-all and needs to be worked out further. There are questions about how this connects with that. I think that as long as we can find dissociations between, if the set of affective disorders is disjoint with the set of ownership disorders, then we need both conditions, even though they're not independent.
Yeah.
So that's a thought. But I completely agree. This needs a lot more work. And I like the sexual embodiment stuff and the stuff about becoming flesh and so on. I think there's very, very nice work done on that, actually, even within the analytic tradition, by people who are very much interested in Freud. Richard Wollheim, in a lot of his essays, in The Thread of Life, and also in his book of psychoanalytical essays, discussed this under the bodily ego in India, the sort of Kleinian approach. So there are things here to explore, I think, from the psychoanalytic tradition. Cotards, okay, good. I don't think it's because I'm a closet Cartesian. Oh, now the cat.
We really want that video.
This will become a huge hit, right? Philosophy conference in Istanbul. Even the cats are interested.
So I think you're right that in some of these. I agree in some of the cases I should analyze them as deprivations of subjectivity rather than embodiment. I was just thinking that there might be cases of deprivations of embodiment too, and we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
I'm happy with that.
I completely agree. And there's much more work for me to do there. So I'm not intending to lump all cases as deprivations of embodiment just because I think there's a relation between subject and body. So it could be, if you have disorders in the unity of consciousness, it's not a disorder in embodiment.
And that's why I think Cotards might be a bit like that.
Okay, good. So there we agree. Touch. Okay, good. I think if there's one thing that that has really struck me in the last 3 days of challenges from Lucas, it's that he's really drummed it into me that I should write more about touch in this book. So I will.
Okay.
Touch is immensely difficult. It's immensely difficult, and so a couple people have written books on touch recently in philosophy. Matthew Fulkerson, I think, has written, and a couple people have challenged the kind of connection between touch and bodily sensations that is from O'Shaughnessy, this template model of touch in 1989, Australasian Journal of Philosophy, and there's another Australasian Journal article whose author I don't remember. And some of these issues need to be discussed and distinguished, but I agree that once you bring in touch, because it's a somatic sense, this gets missed. And I completely agree with you that as I understand them too, the action and perception conditions are not so separate. So the reason why they're separate initially for people like Shoemaker and Strawson is because of these cases where you have bilocation or you have teleportation and stuff like that. And that doesn't reflect normal functioning, it reflects metaphysics.
No, but you can have the perception condition in cinema without. So I think you can have the perception without the action. But I actually think having the action without any perception, maybe that's not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
It depends on which kinds of cases you want to focus on. But there's a sense in which the conditions, even though they're separate conditions, in the functioning they go together. So that's important. Okay, extensions. So I think what I've covered gives the core of representational account of embodiment, and then question is whether it can deal with extensions. I think I can easily deal with extensions in a way. It's just I don't discuss them. And here a range of cases of extensions. So you have two use, out-of-body illusions based on avatars, rubber hand illusions. This is first-person avatar. This is a prosthetic, and this is a hand graft. So in the case of a hand graft, what you need is you need to have the appropriate kinds of connections. You need to begin to represent it as that way when you can act and perceive with it, and when you don't have rejection of it. So you have ownership issues and also issues of affect. And similarly with a prosthetic, you can have those extensions when you begin to be able to act and perceive with it through feeling the prosthetic foot as resisting the ground for you, supporting your weight, and so on and so forth. Often in these cases, incorporation is faster when they have a phantom limb, and they use that image in order to control the limb. This is two use. This is actually a very old picture from Bernstein's monograph in the 1940s. And I think if we understand the action condition and relax it a little bit, then we can incorporate such conditions. And then we can write conditions in terms of perception, action, and potentially also proprioception, where we have extensions of this sort.
But I'm suggesting we could also perhaps have feeling from the inside, insofar as it's been incorporated into a limb that we feel from the inside. So it seems to me that, I touch this, I'm touching the table now.
I think so I'd class that as a case of touch, and touch involves bodily sensation, and therefore you have some bodily sensation too. But I wouldn't say you feel it from the inside in that sense, but you have feeling in it.
Well, you feel the limb from the inside, and it's just, so the argument I was making about feeling from the inside doesn't involve feeling every part from the inside. So if you've got something you feel from the inside, and then it's made a bit longer, you've got something slightly longer you feel from the inside. So I think
So I'm a bit puzzled by this dispute, because I always thought that talk of perception from the inside wasn't supposed to be a way of marking out bodily awareness per se. It was that with bodily awareness you can be aware of your body in different ways. And we're just interested in ruling out those kinds of awareness of your body that involve vision and so on. And so we talk about the ways of being aware that are from the inside. But that's not supposed to rule out there being other kinds of perception that we might think of as involving perception in some sense from the inside, but it's not perception of the body. So in the touch cases you're talking about perception of other aspects of the world from the inside, and that's fine. I don't see that. I really can't understand why that's in any way.
Here you've even got proprioception. So you move. Suppose you just grow really long fingernails, that in some sense, as your fingernail grows, it starts off as part of something of your finger that you feel from the inside, and then as it grows...
Hong Yu can say there can be cases of perceiving things that might involve both bodily awareness and awareness of the thing, and that's fine. It's that form of bodily awareness that's awareness of the body from the inside. And in virtue of that, it might be that you're also aware of the table from the inside, but... There, I can't see that we really need to rule out anything, so telling us it's from the inside is not really adding anything in a way of sort of picking out the phenomenon that we're interested in. So I have to say, I found this discussion of from the inside warriors for the last couple of days a little bit puzzling for that reason.
I think Ilan wants to counter your remark.
Not really counter, but I think it's actually in the same spirit. So first I think we have this problem because of that from inside was not very well specified. I think part of the reason is coming from that. So you might think, for example, I feel this comment is in the spirit. So you might think that, the things that constitute the body image, right, is different than the perception doesn't feed into the body image. And because when we work with tools, right, by touch, right, we are not so by touch we're also connected to these objects, and our relation to these objects and how these objects are incorporated in the body image seems to be very different than other objects. Now, whether this incorporation in the body image is enough to consider them, perceived from or being aware of inside or not, right? So now that after all that discussion, we realize it's not. But the thing is, when you just use, because in the first formulation of the from inside is from inside as opposed to one object among many, from inside and direct action as opposed to remote control, right? So, but of course, there's one direct action with your body, and there's the remote control of the flying drone from away. But there's also, the kind of control you have over other things where you are physically attached by touch, such as the wheel, right? That seems to be the dichotomy, leaves the things in the between.
Yeah, so
not
but that makes it
specified.
sound like you think the from the inside is going to do the work of answering the question, is this part of my body? And the thought is, well, if it's from the inside, it's then part of my body. But I took it that when most people are using that term, they're not using it to do that job. They're just using it to mark out this kind of perception of my body versus a range of other kinds of ways of perceiving my body. So I didn't think Hong Yu was trying to employ it to do that extra job. I thought he was just demarcating the territory, as it were.
Exactly. There's someone who does try to employ it to do that job, AJ Ayer, for example.
So actually I think you just cannot say you touch the table. Why not? With the tool. Why not? Because touch is like getting textural information, force and so on and so on. And it is true that you get kind of the rubberiness, like how much force it exploit against the pen, but you don't get all the other things of the touch. When you do that, then you get all the features of touch, and touch is like the things when you get all the features, like texture and so on and so on, and geometric shape and so on and so on. And I am not sure that if you use a tool to figure out the geometric shape of something, I think it wouldn't work too. So, like, touch has a function which is getting geometric shape bigger than finger size, smaller. There is a long list. And you can do very few things only with how much resistance the things has with a stick, but nothing else. So you don't get touch, you get some role which touch plays, but it's not touch. And I agree with that it's a different object, and the inside and outside was for. And then other things about the drone. So when you suppose the drone things just collapse or whatever, you lose the thing. It's not true that you lose everything, because if you have proprioception, then you have proprioception in your body, so you know you are sitting or not sitting. So you have actually extremely many information. It's not true that you just lose the information because the drone collapses. And if you think about the drone case, then you will have actually two here in that case, because the drone will have a visual here, and you will have a somatosensory here where you are. So it's just a much more difficult case than you think so. And the embodiment, you might say there is something like visually embodied and proprioceptionally embodied, and for that the drone case would be a good case to draw attention to.
I just want to follow up on this but one thing that seemed a little bit compelling with oh my God,
Lucas
I'm tired. Lucas's comment was when he talked about the different parts of the body. So, can I not touch you with this part of my back because, I don't know, I'm missing a bunch of the features that are in my finger. And then the second thing I went, right, so when you say this state, all you get is push, I mean, yes, it's impoverished relative to your finger, but so are different parts of our body. But when we say, I'm not touching you with that part of my body. And then the second one I wanted to ask is, would it make any difference if it turned out that for blind people, the phenomenology of touching is actually like seeing the table? Maybe not the table, but seeing the hallway or seeing the door or something like that? I don't know, but I wonder if the phenomenology for blind people is, I'm not touching the ground, I'm seeing the ground. And if it were, if that creates some sort of difficulty.
On that, I mean, the general way I set up my project is such that the paradigm cases, and there can be departures from it such that you get very interesting phenomena depending on what's really important for function. So I'd be completely happy to embrace blind people as having a different structure of embodiment and phenomenology in some core cases.
Then it doesn't cause a problem though that it's external to you. But
no,
internal,
so-
the way we would say, I see with my eyes, and they say,
so
I see with
they
my...
would represent their body in a different way from us.
But
Okay.
I would think that two kind of touch, like touching this something and touching with the hand, will have different properties. And you
But what about
get-
touching with the back and touching with a stick?
So usually touch is such that you usually touch with the finger because that is the best for that. So you have like much more sensor on your finger, and even the pointing finger have more sensor than the other finger for touch. So you don't use that to touch. When something touch, you wouldn't touch something actively just with your finger. Very rarely, like the
So you
rhinoceros
can't
kind of.
touch with other parts of your body, you're saying?
No, it's not, because there are it's too long, but there are
Okay.
ecological strategies. You use an ecological strategy to get something which you get through touching by you would use by the hand. When you want to catch your hand back, then you would use your back, but it's not ecological. So even if you want to have for example, you want to know what is the texture of something, you would do that. But you don't do other strategy, and everyone would do that because that is the appropriate strategy to get the texture. So there are some strategies which we will use, all of us, and it's like close to 100%, like Katz has some kind of big statistical things about it, and we always know what is the optimal strategy, and we always use the optimal strategy. Of course, if we haven't had, then we would have other.
I think so. I think I can deal with the extensions by just augmenting.
Oh yeah, I wasn't suggesting you couldn't. I just think this is another source maybe of information about the normal case.
No,
Because
definitely.
you have certain extensions and then things don't work in the same way, so they're going to be a bit different.
Yeah.
And that can also help us understand the normal case. So this was like Ishvan's point about, in terms of the methodology, not just looking at pathologies, but also extensions, because
Yeah.
this can also help you understand the normal case.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't see these as helping this project very much.
Okay.
So, in an extended version of this work, I would use these as ways of testing whether this account can be applied further, rather
Okay.
than ways of developing the account in the first
So
place.
not in terms of giving evidence for your
Yeah.
account.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. But I'm happy to embrace these extensions. I'm not happy to embrace extensions of the sort where the plane is the body of the fighter pilot. I'm not going there. So some people might go there. It's a body in some sense. It's certainly a system. It can be a functional unity. Finally, modal status of these claims. Yes, I agree. I have to make that much clearer.
I think your position is becoming more clear. Like I'm getting a better idea of it, and I think the Aristotelian capacity is sort of it's a dependency, but not a set of necessary conditions. But there is,
Yeah, it's not necessary conditions. It's necessary-ish. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, and so what I would like to do, I would like to bring in a set of embodiments of instances of embodiment that we haven't been talking about too much, and with it, actually maybe I could. This comes from my background in sociology, and with it maybe I think that maybe I could contribute, to that to your account of the 5 aspects of embodiment as you are talking about. So I'm not sure whether these instances can fit completely within these 5 aspects that you have enumerated, or whether we need another one. And I think this might be of interest to you. As sociologists, we would like to think of certain collective or social actions in terms of embodiment. And there are some very interesting theories, and there are some very good theoreticians on these matters. One kind of instances that we want to think in this way is a social orientation towards some kind of an action. I'll give you an example. It will be much clearer. Just imagine a community of people living in a certain place, and for a very long time, for some reason, nobody goes to a certain place in the village, or just outside the village. Nobody tells the children, do not go there. maybe they tell the children not to go there if the child has strayed into that place, but that's not a precondition. Typically there is this collective idea, there is this collective action that you notice that people don't go there. Another kind of action like that. So, for example, if you look at the way in which house spaces are organized in different cultures, you'll notice certain patterns. And these patterns might mean like how a person thinks of a space, but this is a space where I can sit. So when a person enters the house, some people might go to the very back and sit, some people might sit next to the door, and you notice certain very clear, let's say, patterns. So you have certain communities in which the back of a house has certain, sometimes representation or certain related behavioral patterns to it, and in other cultures it will be very different. And a very interesting theory was put forward by Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu. He was very interested in this kind of things. Actually, another example of his very famous is that a certain social class, for example, might not eat fish. And when you want to explain that, and also the effective side to it, there is disgust over it, and there are certain explanations that they would give. Again, when you look at the level at which that embodiment takes place, it's the community, it's the social class, it's this kind of, at least a system of bodies, at the very least, that the embodiment takes place. And Bourdieu proposed a model, he's called habitus. So he said habitus is, he thought of it as a certain field of potentialities of ordering the bodies. So basically the bodies become ordered in a certain way, in a certain social context, not through language, not necessarily through some other similar processes, but just because through certain processes, a certain ordering, a certain mode of ordering has been developed within that system. And in this way, you would explain how, for example, like this kind of spontaneous ordering of bodies that does not allow somebody to go to that place in the village. Interestingly, this has also a parallel on the evolutionary part. So if you think about, for example, a scorpion, when the light is turned on or when it hears some sound, it goes to this narrowest of places, finds the narrowest place in the environment and goes and hides there. And I would like to be able to think of that also as some kind of an embodied action. The question here, of course, is whether we can put these embodied action within a framework like the one that you have said, or is this orientation that I have been talking about some different aspect that we have to take into account. Of course, when we look at the mechanism through which that type of embodiment occurs, it is of course a bodily mechanism. We can argue for certain representations that make the organism go in a certain direction, or we may argue about certain reflexes in the evolutionary case. But at the same time, like the question here is, at what level is it appropriate, at what basic level is it appropriate to think of that embodiment? Is it at the level of a singular organism, or is it at the level of that community, at the level of a species, as in the mind of a scorpion? And in that case, I would think we would think about it at the level of a system, then maybe we have to think about this orientation, this field that orients one's body as one aspect, or one that should be maybe included in a paradigm of human embodiment as well.
Okay, thanks. So, I almost never work on social things because almost anything that is social is too difficult and way above my pay grade. So I think that lots of social things enter into basic human and animal existence and so on and so forth. But here, the paradigm way which I think human is, it's an individual, but it's an individual which exists in a part of a society. And that goes into the characterization of what it means to be human, but I don't think has to be articulated in the conditions on what it means to have paradigm human embodiment. But of course, there can be notions of embodiment applied for human societies, animal societies, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can I just add a small comment? So my trouble with a collective, with an individual locus is that sometimes we cannot really explain the shape, like the way, the instance of embodiment as it appears. So, for example, like you know, I'm sure that you know from your studies. Yes, I'm sorry. So, for example, think about culturally specific psycho abnormalities like attacking nervous, like nervous attack. You can imagine that in order to explain it, one has to think about that.
Yeah, I agree that social things are important. It's just that I think we need to give individualistic accounts of certain things, and giving an individualistic account doesn't mean that you want to exclude that there are social conditions. So yeah, I agree.
Well, can I go back to Lucas's question about metaphysical neutrality, and maybe ask it in a slightly different way? So he was worried that you've kind of built in this a non-neutral metaphysics by appealing to the idea of a relation. Well, I want to ask, what's the relation between your talk of embodiment in this chapter and the sense of ownership that you discussed in the previous chapter? Because you might think a sense of ownership is just talking about rather specific cases of what now you're generalizing, but that really you could just dissolve all these issues and say you're embodied to the extent that you have a sense of ownership of your body. Or the body in which you're embodied is the one over which you have a sense of ownership, or something to that effect.
Okay,
what would be wrong with?
Couple things. That might be the simplest way of stating the paradigm case. Yes.
So you sort of you've not only you've got them in separate chapters, but you've got this as the insert or the
It simply comes out of It's
as opposed to the.
Yeah. Okay. Good. This is the problem when you're using different strategies. Sometimes you're using the kind of Aristotelian paradigm strategy, and then sometimes you're using the necessary condition strategy, and then okay, good. So the reason why I didn't do that, here's the reason why I didn't do that, not the reason why I shouldn't do that, is that you have cases like IW where he has body ownership but no body awareness. So, but intuitively you don't want to think that IW is a paradigm case, so you want to record this as a condition. And because I want to give an account of embodiment that is in terms of degrees of embodiment, not in terms of embodied, not categorical. And therefore, I think this condition is then important. And then if we then work backwards, and there are people who are paralyzed and people who can't see and so on and so forth, then you need something like the action and perception conditions. But in a way, if you buy the kind of like the video game subject or film subject case as really providing force for why ownership is important. So this is somehow how it all comes together holistically. And then there can be deprivations based on that. So maybe what you're saying is you're pushing me to say that this is the most core conditions, necessary condition, and then these may be lost in different ways, but once you have this, then embodiment is in some way secured. Well, perhaps I would go there.
Very quick question in response to your comments about social embodiment. Do you want to say that you're giving an individualistic account of these?
No, so I'm giving an account.
Giving an account of individual bodies.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not giving an account that precludes them. Yeah.
So, and this ties into a question I was asking about care for the body. So I'm wondering, like...
Yeah, I didn't answer that question.
Yeah,
so I cover it under this condition.
No, but here's the question. Could you recognize a body as yours and not care about it? So do you have people who have the body ownership, they have the experience, of ownership, but they don't care. So do you have any sort of pathologies of care for the body, where the care for the body and the ownership can come apart?
There must be, mustn't there?
Because that would be an interesting case, because you could recognise it as yours but not give a shit.
People who are severely depressed in, say, anorexia or bulimia, they have something resembling that condition. So,
and that might be one way of getting out the effect.
Right.
And
But maybe in bulimia they are taking care of their bodies, like they're obsessed with their bodies a lot. Or anorexia, but in depression.
Well, it's a little bit tricky because they're obsessed with their bodies, but they might not defend their bodies from external threat.
There is something called, it's in English, it's a beautiful difference. It's la femme something, indifference. I don't know. I know it's that you don't care about whatever your pathology is. I don't know if it's about your body or not. But it's where it's just like, again, I don't know if it's about the body, but whatever the pathology is, it's like, oh, I have half my brain missing. Cool. And it's something like la femme indifference is the, again, it may not be about embodiment, but there's the care part for a pathology. So there could be other cases that are.
But I'm confused a little bit. So isn't the idea is that in order to care, right, you probably need ownership. But ownership doesn't necessarily mean that you will care, right? Because it's not.
That was
if you have to, right? So because there should be lots of other motivational reasons for that care doesn't get grip. One way in which care wouldn't get grip is that it's not my body, why would I care? But like because it's my body, it's not automatic that I would care. There must be other things, other motivational forces.
So I'm wondering the people who lose the ownership of their arms, what's that syndrome called? Whether they could, because they might still have, they may still have set self-defense mechanisms.
No.
They don't. So if someone's going to stab them, they don't pull it out of the way.
Usually it comes, so one of the complications is that in actual fact it comes with either a deficit of action or a deficit of a sense of agency.
Because I'd be interested, because I imagine it's possible that you could lose the sense of ownership but still keep some sort of self-protection mechanism, so that if it's attacked, you just, not a reflex, but you pull it away. So I could see those coming apart. So you could have a case where you have this instinct of self-preservation towards this part of your body without.
So there's one possible case, but because it's so poorly described. So if there are cases of body identity integrity disorder which involve a sense of disownership, these guys, it's incorporated into their body schema, so they can walk and so on. They have normal defensive reactions and so on, even though they have reduced skin conductance. So in that case, they have some defensive reactions. They don't care in another sense, and so on, and then you get some dissociations.
But I couldn't catch your answer to that. At the beginning, there was one question. Did you answer that? I don't know. I might not have. You asked about whether these represents need to be at the conscious level or not. So if they don't need to be at the conscious level, right, you might think that this person might be recording all these, emanations, but he might still actually keep the body ownership sense at the subconscious level, and that might explain why he's pulling it. I don't know. What was the answer to that question?
I can answer that.
These represents are conscious or not?
Well, they're not conscious, but they're personal level.
Personal level, okay.
So, if I were from Oxford, I wouldn't use represents, but aware. A subject is aware of herself as internally embodied, blah, 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 blah. But because aware is so loaded, I've used represents as something which is
unloaded.
Less
neutral.
Not neutral, but
so it's like it's personal level, but not necessarily occurrent, not necessarily affected.
No, it's sort of like grasp. It's like grasp, understands.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about an organism grasps herself?
I'm fine with this subject being organism, so I'm okay with that.
That might be better.
Some people would be happier.
Doesn't that make a big difference though?
We have a finger.
Oh, sorry.
Um,
The middle finger to organist. The middle finger to organist.
can I just take
Okay.
this exchange about the organism kind of thing? So in a way, I don't care what you plug in here and here, as long as you're capturing the contrast. So that's the game I'm interested in. So if you're Eric Olson and you want to be hyper rigorous about the metaphysics and so on and so forth, then fine. Then what I can say is that for each account for each metaphysics you can write different conditions. But the spirit of the account in each will be similar in a way, although the metaphysical implications will be different. So in that sense, it doesn't matter, and it matters in a different kind of sense.
So one thing that I think this is a follow-up on Lucas's response. One thing that you insisted on is that your account or theory is metaphysically neutral, and Lucas asked why is it desirable, right, to have a metaphysically neutral theory. If it's a virtue of a theory, it couldn't be just say that materials have another virtue, maybe simplicity. And so the question is, why do you think that your theory is better than, let's say, Metzinger's theory, who denies all the existence of all subjectivity or, selves, and just says these are just phenomenal experiences at the first personal level, conscious experiences, and so on. So just reduce all subjectivity to a certain kind of conscious experience. So why do you think that?
Well, first of all, Metzinger doesn't give an account of embodiment. So at this level,
Oh, exactly. But he does he need?
Well, he might be interested in an account of the embodiment. So Metzinger has no metaphysics. He's just some kind of materialist, and it's not clear what kind of materialist he is. So from that point of view, he's poised to pick up my account and plug it into his phenomenal intentionality mental relation thing. I don't know what it's called. So he wouldn't be opposing this. People who would oppose this are people like animalists, for example. So they would oppose it. And Lucas is coming from a different direction, and the Istanbul process metaphysicians they would oppose it for a different reason. And then maybe if you are a New York field theoretical kind of philosopher of physics, you would want to oppose this in a different direction, but say in the limit you could understand these. So they basically have a Spinozistic metaphysics. And the response would be by saying that subjects and bodies are basically limit points.
And that's also a process metaphysics.
Yeah.
So they're with us.
Yeah. So why is it a theoretical virtue? There are many theoretical virtues. The relevant theoretical virtue that's most important for the project depends on your explanatory purpose, basically. And it's a very flexible thing. And the reason why I chose to go this way is because I think there's something interesting about expressing an account that can capture these contrasts. And I think part of the thought is that no matter whether you're a dualist, materialist, idealist, process metaphysician, or whatever, you have to deal with these cases. And it's a good idea, I think, to be able to give an account to deal with these cases at some level such that we can capture the contrast. And then the ramifications metaphysically of these conditions can differ for each account. So, for example, an obsession of the Oxford Common Room from the 50s until the late 90s was the idea that with conditions like this, you could prove that we're material beings. So they had a form of transcendental argument by Lucas's teacher, Qasim Qassam, for example, that went from the idea Ken hates this.
It was not transcendental.
Well, they think it's transcendental. So a form of, quote, transcendental argument that went from the structure of experience to possible conditions on that type of experience. And the thought was that they would get to from materialism about self-conscious representations to materialism about the self. Okay, and partly I want to block that implication, and that's why I want to remain metaphysically neutral. One way to see why that's the case is there are two ways to see that. First of all, as Beatrice Longinus has pointed out, I mean, you can do as much phenomenology as you want, but if you have substantial union, like what Lucas was discussing in the Simmons article, you can't differentiate between the case where you have material substance only versus the case where you have substantial union. You just can't, from the point of view of phenomenology. Now, that inability to differentiate between substantial union and material substance is also a function, from the flip side, looking at the form of awareness we have of our bodies. So the form of awareness for our bodies does not track whether the object that you are so aware of is a natural unity. It does not require that what you're aware of is a natural unity. Proprioception does not require such conditions. You can rewire proprioception. And because it does not require that it's a natural unity, it's going to be very hard to drive the metaphysics just on that basis.
Two small thoughts on that in line with what you were saying. One is about formulation. Do you really want to say you're giving an account of awareness of the body, or is it rather an account of bodily awareness?
What's at stake?
Well, the problem is trying to read that little word of without bringing in intentionality in ways that make the body into an object of awareness.
Okay.
And I don't think you want that most of the time. Sometimes, yes. But it seems that most of what you've got might better be described as an account of bodily awareness.
Yeah, I'm happy to accept that.
The other thing, just a comment about simplicity. Simplicity has to be earned. And it can only be earned after you've got two equally adequate explanations of some domain of phenomena. And this stuff that we've gotten from Quine that starts with parsimony is just grossly anti-scientific.
Because we very seldom get to the level where we can actually compare two.
Well, you have to have an account first. You can't just say, my account's simpler because I've only got matter. Look, here's an account of everything. Right? All that happens, happens, and nothing else does. Now, you can't get any simpler than that. It's utterly comprehensive. BFD. Parsimony is not a principle to start with. It's at most a principle of selection, but it's only relevant when you've got two equally adequate explanations.
Completely agree.
Answer? Do you have a question? No. No.
I think isn't it time?
Yeah. Oh, thank
Plus
you.
40. Yeah.
So let's have a very quick break. We're a little bit behind, but all we've got to do is we've got 2 more sessions and then we've got dinner.
Yes, but